Our world can be a dangerous place to live in, especially when you know valuable information, as there is no such thing as a key to open someone's mind against their will. The humankind invented a terrific method to squeeze that precious information. It's called torture, and sometimes it's even harder to face than death. And it exists in this world for thousands of years. In the Middle Age, torture was not only used to access information, but also to change beliefs or even for sadistic pleasures. That period of our history is famous for its wars and cruelty, and the torture methods and tools used back then were probably the worst that humanity has ever encountered. So, let's have a look at some of the most terrific torture tools that can make you wish you were dead instead of being in the victim's place. Number 10. The wooden horse. The wooden horse, or the Spanish donkey, doesn't look that scary at first sight. It has no spikes and no screws, and people rarely died on this instrument. But it was a device meant to cause a lot of pain to the victims and eventually make them confess. Although this torture tool was specifically designed for women, it was also used to torture men. The device is made out of a suspended piece of wood with a sharp end pointing upwards. The victim was placed on this torture instrument with the sharp edge between her or his legs. The full body weight was pushing on the victim's clitoris or scrotum, causing an endless, horrible, and continuous pain. Like this wasn't enough, extra weights were strapped to each of the victim's ankles, making the torture even worse. Number 9. The Judas Cradle. The victim was placed above this pyramid-shaped chair, while the top of the pyramid was inserted in the anus or vagina. The waist harness and the additional ropes kept the victim fixed into this desired position. As the ropes were gradually released, the body weight forced the top of the pyramid into the orifice. This intense pressure and stretch basically destroyed the orifice muscles, and the victim died from infection or simply by being impaled. Number 8. The torture chair. There are many versions of this particular torture tool, but the method was as simple as placing the victim on it. Sometimes, those chairs had mobile parts on the sides. Those separate spike walls were pressed on the victim at different stages of torture. The spikes would press the arms, legs, waist, and the back of the victim, and the skin would eventually get pierced. Imagine that all this time, the victim is strapped to the chair with no way of escape. Moreover, moving on this chair would only make the situation worse. The victim's agony lasted from a few hours to even days due to the fact that no spike affected any vital organ during the torture and that the wounds were closed by the spikes, preventing blood loss. It was a common practice to extract a confession by forcing the victim to watch someone else being tortured with this instrument. Number 7. The torture bed. The torture bed was a really popular tool in the Middle Age. This tool was made out of a wooden bed and a mechanism that stretched the ropes which were tied to the victim's arms and legs. The victim was painfully stretched until his articulations broke one by one. This torture could eventually rip the victim in half. Because of the slow and continuous pain, this torture method was also one of the most effective in interrogatories. Number 6. The Spanish Tickler. This torture tool was basically a handlebar with some curved metal spikes attached on the other side. It was a raw tool used to tear the skin and the flesh off from bones or any other part of the body. The victim was tied to a fixed support in order to prevent him or her from escaping. The torture process was simply horrific. It started with the hands and the legs, then the chest, the back, and the neck. Basically, there was no chance for the victim. The death was slow and painful. And just imagine your body completely skinned. Number 5. The wheel torture. The wheel torture, or the breaking wheel, was typically a large wooden wagon wheel with many radial spokes. The condemned were lashed to the wheel and their limbs were beaten with a club or iron hammer, with the gaps in the wheel allowing the limbs to give way and break. Once his bones were broken, he was left on the wheel to die, sometimes placed on a tall pole so the birds could feed from the still living victim. This method was only used for capital punishment in public executions, being a really effective method to teach masses a lesson. Number 4. The head smasher. This tool was really popular, especially in Inquisition. The method was pretty basic but incredibly painful. The metal helmet was placed on the victim's head while his chin was fixed on the bottom stand. Then, by rotating the large screw, the helmet pushed the victim's skull while the chin remained fixed. Eventually, the pressure would crack the victim's teeth and mandible, and afterwards the skull will follow. After facing cruel mutilation, the victim would eventually be left to die in horrible pain and agony. Number 3. The rat torture. The rat torture was one of the cheapest methods to get confessions in the medieval times. This method has its origins in China, but it was adopted and heavily used in the United Kingdom. There are many variations in which rats were used to torture victims, but one of the most sadistic ones implies placing a metal cage with rats over the victim's abdomen, head, or any other part of the body. The cage was enclosed, having only one door at the top. Big rodents were placed inside and this door was sealed. Afterwards, the cage was heated by placing a hot piece of charcoal on its top. The rat's natural instinct is to panic and look for a way to escape this heat. As the cage walls were no option for them, the rats will start to dig in the victim's abdomen, tearing anything in their way. This torture could take hours to end, and all this time the victim is conscious, facing a horrific pain while the rat chews the flesh and the vital organs. The victims eventually died either by the severe wounds or by the heavy infections. Number 2. The Brazen Ball. The Brazen Ball, or the Bronze Ball, is a torture method that has its origins in the ancient Greece. In fact, it is more a way of killing than an instrument of torture, as nobody ever escaped alive from this instrument. The Brazen Ball is actually a full-sized ball made entirely from bronze with a door on one side. The inside of the ball is empty, projected in this manner in order to fit a man inside. What is interesting about this statue is that it had some kind of acoustic system which converts the victim's screams into the sound of a raging bull. The process was simple. The victim was placed inside the statue, the door was closed, and a fire was set up under the bull. The agony and the pain experienced by the victim was the worst nightmare someone can experience. The skin was melting and sticking to the hot bronze as the victim was literally roasting to death in terrible pain. Number 1. The sharp and thick poles. It may sound basic, but this was probably the cruelest method of execution in the Middle Age. It was a punishment method that gave the pseudonym of Vlad the Impaler to Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, also known as Dracula. He preferred this method to punish enemies, traitors, and thieves. This emperor was feared for his cruelty and responsible for some of the worst atrocities ever committed in this world. He forced mothers to eat their roasted children and husbands to eat the breasts of their women, only to have them impaled afterwards. The victims were thrown into those long, sharp poles and left there hanging until they gave their last breath. Some of the victims were lucky, dying instantly because of the fatal wounds, others not. If the stick avoided the vital organs, the victim would be left hanging into those poles for up to 2 or 3 days of agony until they eventually died. It's a horrible way to die and a very efficient way to inspire fear and terror among people, as most of those executions were public.
If you like what you saw, hit that big red subscribe button and help us push more interesting stories to people like you. Thank you very much for watching, see you next time.